as promised, we have Professor Peter Loge from GW. I don't want to take up much of Professor Loge's time because our time is limited, so I'll just say that he's had a varied and illustrious career in academia, politics, entertainment, everything from writing a bestseller on what soccer can teach us about management thinking, to being a satirist for NPR, to being a lobbyist, to being an analyst. So much more interesting than the usual fare that you get. And without further ado, Peter, I will hand it over to you. So thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. How is everybody? You good? You're psyched? You're pumped?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Intrigued. I like intrigued. I like intrigued. It's a Friday afternoon. What better than to think and talk about ethics? I gave a similar talk to this in Corvallis a couple of weeks ago, Oregon State University, on a Monday night, and it tells you a lot about Corvallis, Oregon, that on a Monday night, 300 people showed up. Because in Corvallis, if you're looking at your schedule on Monday, you're thinking, what are you doing tonight? What's going on? Well, there's this ethics thing. So that or MacGyver. So here, I'm flattered you're here. You have other choices. All right. So I'm Peter Loge. I'm an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University, political consultant, and I started the project on ethics and political communication to promote the study, teaching, and practice of political communication ethics. Feels like it ought to be a thing. Feels like it ought to be a thing. And one of the reasons I think it ought to be a thing is, to quote Lee Pelton, the president of Emerson College, my alma mater, "The world is still in want of clear-headed citizens tempered by historical perspective, disciplined by rational thinking and moral compass, who speak well and write plainly." Seems pretty straightforward. When you talk about political communication ethics, it begs a couple of questions. First of all, the question on the table is, what ethical responsibility, if any, do political communicators have, and to whom or what do they have them? What is it we're talking about when we talk about ethics or political communication? I want to unpack this a little bit, walk through some of the history of this, some of the things to think about, some of the obvious, hopefully the non-obvious stuff, and we'll see how it goes. Right. So the first question is, what is an ethical responsibility? And if I taught at Boston College or at Georgetown, it would be easy. My students and I would debate all semester, and in the end, the Jesuits would win. I do not teach at a Jesuit university. This isn't one. GW isn't one. So there is no obvious answer. Right? How do you, all of you think you're doing the right thing. None of you woke up this morning thinking, you know, I could do something good or I could do something profoundly evil. I know I'm going to do something profoundly evil. When you act, you do it in ways that you think make sense. If you get involved in politics or you volunteer in a campaign or you promote your neighborhood or whatever it is, you think you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, but a lot of us don't stop to think about what those reasons are. Sorry, is that a Boston Scores jersey? I've been involved with DC Scores from the beginning. Well done. I'm sorry?
I worked there.
At what? Just DC Scores from the start of the organization. So, great group. Sorry, you need to, as a soccer guy, you need to know about Boston Scores. You two need to talk about that. This is how it's going to go, by the way, for the whole conversation. At any rate, what is that ethical foundation? Right? For some people, it's a Gospel of Paul. For others, it's a Torah, the Quran. It's your grandmother. It's your You look in the mirror, it's your kid, whatever, but there's got to be a thing, right, a rock on which we're standing. Because otherwise what we do is we do what we think is the right thing, then we do the next thing, then we do the next thing, then we do the next thing. Right? You're studying the ethics of policy or public policy ethics. There are arguments for those ethics or arguments for those policies. And if it's the right policy, how do you know? Right? There's actually a nod to the trolley car problem a little later in the conversation. But how do you know what that thing is? And I don't. I have an idea what it is for me, but I think that everybody who talks about public policy or promotes politics should think about it and try to answer that. The second question is, what's political communication? There's the obvious answer, right? We're in the middle of a campaign season. It never seems to end. Thomas Hobbes wrote that for man in a state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Feels like for political campaigns, they're nasty, brutish, and long. We think about, you got TV ads, you've got social media, you've got direct mail. We talk about candidate stuff, but most of politics most of the time isn't candidates, right? Most of politics most of the time is things like World Wildlife Fund or the NRA or the ACLU or Amnesty International. People that are promoting policy or promoting ideas, who want you to get to do a certain thing or want elected officials to do a certain thing. Most of Washington most of the time doesn't work for candidates. That only happens every couple of years, and we need to work more often than every couple of years. Candidates are frankly a pain in the ass. They have parents and they have spouses, and you've got to deal with them. Anybody who's worked on campaigns at a senior level has stories about the candidate's mom calling, or the candidate's wife, or the candidate's kid, or they're a pain. It's also not where most of this stuff happens, right? Politics doesn't stop after an election, right? We had the vote on articles of impeachment, the impeachment hearings yesterday. That's part of politics. We'll be voting on whether or not how much money the University of Massachusetts schools get from the Massachusetts legislature. Right? They're voting on community colleges, they're voting on roads, they're voting on transportation, they're voting on the environment. That's all part of politics and all part of political communication. So from where I sit, political communication is how we talk about the policies you're doing next. You're studying the ethics of policy, it's how you promote those policies, it's the conversation around those. I would also suggest that if you're thinking what you're doing is ethical because it's not political communication, it feels a little smarmy, but it's okay because it's not political communication, I would suggest maybe you're thinking about it wrong. The point is be ethical. Don't just be ethical because it's political communication. The last question that isn't here, but it's embedded in this, is why be ethical? Why should you follow ethics at all? And one of the things I've done for the project is I have a 5-question series where I ask political people of all stripes, students, professionals, journalists, the same 5 questions. And one of them is, why should somebody be ethical? Why should somebody who talks about politics be ethical? And one of the answers inevitably is because you'll get caught. Right? Be ethical because bad things will happen if you're not ethical. Right? Which I mean, it makes sense. You can sort of understand where that comes from, but it's also a little bit weird. Very few people say be ethical because it's the right thing to do. You should be good because being good is good. Right? If you want to be ethical because you're going to get caught, that assumes 1, you're going to get caught, and 2, bad things will happen. Not everybody who lies in politics loses their job. And we'll see how much that bears out in the next election. For my industry, what I do as a consultant, I want to be seen to be ethical and above board because I go from client to client to client. Right? Again, I haven't worked for a candidate in a long time, but I've worked for Oxfam, the ACLU, World Wildlife Fund, and other groups you've heard of. And if I'm a jerk once, then why should anybody hire me the next time? But there's also this idea that you should be ethical because being ethical is the good thing to do. If there weren't any consequences, why should you be ethical? I went to St. Thomas's Day School as a kid in New Haven, Connecticut, where I grew up. And for 2 months of the year, November, December, you had to be good because Santa Claus. Right? The other 10 months of the year, you can't hold Santa over a 7-year-old's head in February because 7-year-olds don't think that far ahead. Because I was at St. Thomas's Day School, it was hell. So for 10 months of the year, you've got to be good because God's watching. 2 months of the year, you've got to be good because Santa's watching. And when you're 7, Santa just carries a little bit more weight. But even then, the idea is there's consequences. Any of you watch The Good Place, the TV show The Good Place? I love The Good Place. It's a sitcom with a philosopher on retainer. It just makes me happy. One of the premises, or one of the questions The Good Place asks is, why be good if you're already dead? Like if the point is, if you're not good in this life, in the next life you'll be punished. But if you're in the next life, you can't die. You can't go to hell because you're there. You can't go to heaven because you're there. So why be good? And in politics, I think you should be good, for my take, is be good because being good is good. Find this ethical foundation and believe in it. I believe deeply in our republic and in the promise of democracy. It is deeply and profoundly flawed. Right? The guy who wrote all men are created equal owned slaves. That's a problem. But he also created a system in which that problem could be addressed and resolved. Right? It's Langston Hughes. Any of you know Langston Hughes? Somebody tell the people who's Langston Hughes? Tell me more about the man.
I don't know that much.
African-American poet, mid-20th century, early 20th century. Wrote this amazing poem called Let America Be America Again. And in the poem, he talks about America being an America that isn't true, but it needs to be the promise of that America. Right? And he believed deeply in the promise of America, all the while saying that America has really blown it for African Americans who were stolen from their home countries, their homelands, and built this country. But for him, it's that promise, right? So for me, that's why be good, because I'm sort of helping fulfill that promise. But you need to figure out for yourselves why be good, right? The last thing I would say, before we get into it too much, is it's not the big questions that are going to bother you. Don't take the bag of cash. Somebody offers you the bribe, don't take it. That's pretty easy, right? And that happens sometimes in politics, not much. I've spent I've been doing this for a long time, and I spent a lot of part of 2016 flying around the country with the commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And we were in Boston for a couple days, we were in San Francisco, we were all over the country. And we're meeting with industry executives, we were meeting with medical school presidents of medical schools, researchers, all this. And at no point did somebody come up to me and say, I own a medical device company, and we've got a device that's sort of stuck in the FDA approval process. But I just want you to take another look at it. I don't want you to violate the rules, I don't want you to cheat, but could you just do me a solid and take another look at this? By the way, is that your Gucci bag of cash you accidentally left in the corner? If they had done that, I'm not sure that I would be at UMass Boston on November 1st. I might be in the Caymans. But no one has ever offered me that bribe. It happens. I had a conversation with a graduate student at GW who spent 10 years as a lawyer in the ethics office in DC government, which is a weird little merry-go-round on itself. And he said that at one point there was a DC government official who was arrested for accepting $50,000 in a coffee cup. That's right, exactly. My first thought, everybody's first thought isn't, oh my God, he took a $50,000 bribe. It's, how do you put that much money in a coffee cup? Is it like a jumbo cup and they're layered? Is it one of the big, I don't know. But it happens. Filled with diamonds. It was just one Krugerrand in a to-go cup.
Only in America, right? In Europe, the sizes are smaller.
See, that's why there's less corruption in Europe, because they drink espresso. I figured this is like what, $1,000 bribe cup? We should start labeling that. That would be the. I
didn't want it to get wet.
And that's how I'd want the coffee too badly. What's this money doing in the way of my coffee? It happens, but not much.
Like Diana was saying, if we had bribes, the cookies would be better.
Oh, by all means.
But you take the $50,000 and roll it into cookies. That's a really good professor if you're willing to take that bigger bribe and turn it into good. There's an adjunct at GW, one of my colleagues, who used to be the communications person for Jeff Sessions when he was the Attorney General. And adjunct professors, at least at GW, you teach a class a week, you don't get paid very much. They pay you in sacks of grain, basically. She takes what little money she makes and turns it into food for her students. So she feeds, and they eat well. It's kind of a, yeah, but for those of us who don't, it's a weird, like they'll come into my class with leftovers from her class. At any rate, the point is, it's not the big stuff. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, This Side of Paradise, amazing American author, he wrote this essay in 1936 for Esquire magazine in which he wrote about his own demise. It's this brutal essay. Fitzgerald writes that he was a creature of the Jazz Age. He helped create the Jazz Age and wrote about its explosion and its wonder. And when the Jazz Age collapsed, he collapsed with it and he couldn't not. Right? His failure was the failure. And he died basically broke and drunk in a gutter in Hollywood. And at the beginning of it, he writes that it's not the big blows you notice. It's not the bribe. It's not the things you tell your friends about. It's the little things that you do in the moment that you don't notice until it's too late. By the time you do notice, it is far, far too late. It's the little step. It's in politics, in the world in which I work, we're going to use these talking points. They're not exactly right, but they're close enough. Don't worry about it. We'll fix it on the back end. Right? It's your boss says something really stupid in a meeting, and you're thinking, I'm not going to pick this fight. It's a Friday. I want to beat the bridge traffic. Right? I'm going to the Cape for the weekend. I'm not going to get stuck in that traffic to pick this fight with this SOB boss. And you go. Right? When I was the chief of staff in the House of Representatives during the last impeachment, and I have to tell you, it's an awful, awful process. And there's chairs. We can bring a chair back or something. I may go too. It's okay. It's not. If I get bored, I'll follow you out. She's got sushi. There's cookies there's a whole food thing going on. But it's the little bits that you don't notice. And what will end up happening is you'll say, look, here's my ethical line. Yeah, but I'm just going to go a little bit this way. Now you have a new ethical line. Then you go a little bit, you go to a new ethical line. A new ethical line. And pretty much you're effectively blanked out by everything you've done. So pay attention to the little. That said, okay, so now we're going to get to actually kind of the point of the conversation. Democracy, in my view, is an argument for itself. Right? Democracy isn't an outcome. It's the process by which outcomes are reached, and as such, it is its own outcome. It's its own end. It's a means of making decisions, but it's also the point of its decisions. You don't win democracy. Right? Democracy is not a huge escape room or Rubik's Cube to figure out. At no point is one of you going to stand up and say, I've got it. This is how we do everything. Roads and water and immigration and telecommunications infrastructure and education. And even if you could, and you participated and you participated and you participated like a massive parallel processor, at no point do you stand up and say, aha, we've won. The point of democracy is the conversation about democracy. Right? Our founding documents were a structured argument. The House of Representatives will do this, they'll be elected by these people. We'll argue, there'll be an election and a decision. In the Senate, it used to be elected out of the state legislature. So they will have a debate, then a decision, and then something happens. Courts, you have an argument and then a decision. It's a series of how to have an argument. As such, how you have that argument matters and the content of that argument matters. Democracy is an ongoing conversation into an uncertain future. If we knew the best way forward on healthcare, education, race, traffic, water, whatever, we'd just do it. It's not like we've got a box of answers somewhere and it's your job as people to find them, right, with a bunch of philosophers standing on the sidelines yelling, cooler, cooler, warmer, warmer. That's not how it goes. Right? Our founding, when the Pilgrims landed in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the shining city upon the hill, they didn't stumble across a bucket of democracy in the road. What is this? I don't know. This looks like an edible food. What's that? That's a way to govern ourselves. Quick, gather that harvest of democracy. That's not how it works. We argue about how we argue about things. As such, how we argue about it matters. And this is a weird, controversial thing to say, that everybody should be able to participate in this conversation. Right? Aristotle, there's room up front, or there's room there. You can just grab the mic. The mic's live. All of us are good at different things. Right? Some of you are better at math, some of you are better at science, some of you are better at English, some of you are faster, some of you are quicker, some of you, like, I'm a soccer guy. So hence the scores piece. I'm built like a soccer player, right? I am not going to be good at hockey. I'm 6'2", 185. I am not a hockey player. I'm terrible at math. One reason I don't have a PhD is because I've blown advanced methods in 3 departments at 2 universities. Not my strength. But somehow we all think everybody can be equally good at governing, or leading, or making complicated decisions about our healthcare system, or education, or transportation, or race, or poverty, which is a weird thing to think. We've all got different strengths and weaknesses, except for the thing that matters most when we can all do it. The idea that it's weird is not new. Plato in Protagoras, some of you remember Plato? He played soccer here a number of years ago. He spent a lot of time beating up on the sophists, who were traveling wise men. They were itinerant condottieri of the intellectual world, one of whom was named Protagoras. And in this dialogue, the story roughly goes, any of you watch Columbo, the TV show Columbo? So as far as you know, this is going to be a great Columbo impersonation. And if you've actually seen Columbo, just roll with it. So Hippocrates is this young man, and he bangs on Socrates' door one day. Get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. Protagoras is in town. Protagoras is in town. We've got to go talk to Protagoras. And Socrates is like, dude, it's early. Can you just dial it back a bit? Why do you want to study under Protagoras? He says, well, he knows wise things. Yeah, but wise about what? Well, stuff. He's smart. Yeah, but smart about what? Protagoras says, I don't know. And Socrates says that's problematic because when the soul is in question, for knowledge is the food of the soul. You have to be careful you're not poisoned. And for Socrates, food of the soul wasn't a metaphor. He meant it. And he compared it to meat. If you go to the market and you buy meat and you don't know about meat, you take it home, you show it to your roommate, is this good? Right? You can do that. It's like you've done this at home with your roommates or your brothers or sisters. Here, taste this milk. Is this milk spoiled? And they drink it and they spit it. Yes, it's spoiled. Right? It's that, but with knowledge. Hippocrates says, I'd never thought of it that way before. We should probably go talk to Protagoras. So Socrates says, great, I'll go talk to Protagoras for you because I'm a helpful guy that way. And they go meet Protagoras, and Socrates doing his best, Peter Falk as Columbo impersonation says, Protagoras, it's great to see you. Everybody says you're the smartest, you're fantastic. It's an honor to be in your presence. I just have one question, just one thing puzzles me. What do you teach? He says, well, I teach people how to be better. So better at what? What do you, that's great. One thing bothers me. If you were a painter, you teach them about painting. If you're a carpenter, you teach them about carpentry. If you're a doctor, you teach them about medicine. What do you teach them about? This is the good bit. What's the subject? The proper care of his personal affairs, so that he may best manage his own household and the state's affairs, so as to become a real man of power in the city, both as a speaker and a man of action. Socrates. I take you to be describing the art of politics, promising to make men good citizens. That, Socrates, is exactly what I profess to do. I did not think this was something that could be taught. Protagoras claims to teach what I teach, what you teach in the philosophy of policy, the premise of democracy. That you can be good citizens and that you can learn how to be good citizens. Right? And for Plato, you can't, because you can't know the nature of the good or the just or the true. So how can you teach people how to be a good citizen if you can't tell me what the nature of the good is? But in the democracy, we say, you know what? That's in the future. The best is unknowable or unknown. Or if it's knowable, it's only known for the Greeks as by the gods, plural. Right? So all us mere mortals can do is argue about it and come up with the best way forward, and hopefully the best argument wins. And the ethical arguments are inherently more persuasive for Protagoras, for Aristotle, and for others. But as soon as this happens, in 94, Quintilian, not 1994, 94, the Roman orator Quintilian again criticizes it and basically says he levels the same criticism that people level against me. All of you have strong opinions about lobbyists. How many of you like lobbying? Have a good, favorable opinion of lobbyists? Lobbyists bad guys? Yes. Yeah? Okay, I'm one of them. Spin doctors? People who write speeches, hide behind the scenes and get politicians to say clever things? Yeah, I'm one of them. Work in private industry, lobby for private industry, then go into government and then go back out again? That'd be one of me. Right. All of your complaints and your concerns and criticisms Quintilian had in 94. Again, there's nothing before the 9 in that. Right? And it's that as soon as somebody learns how to be clever or teaches you how to speak cleverly, morals go out the window. Right? So I'm not worried about good policy. I'm a political hack. Right? I'm good at explaining things. I don't really know anything. I'm much more like Protagoras. I love Protagoras. I'm a big Protagoras fan. But I don't actually know anything. I know this much about this many things. Right? I can talk to you knowledgeably for about 3 minutes about opioids, the precision medicine initiative, the cancer moonshot, copyright, vertical and horizontal integration of the media, but no more than that. Right? And for Quintilian, this is problematic because people will lie, and that lying will hurt you. Right? And this isn't just an over there, somewhere else problem. This is an American thing, and from America we've been doing this from the beginning. Before he was a famous song and dance man, Alexander Hamilton was a political philosopher. Nobody? Nobody? That works about a third of the time. Hamilton, musical, Broadway, all the kids. Thank you. You and I are I like you. I like his shirt, but I like you. Oops. So, in Federalist 1, the Federalist Papers were, of course, PR for the Constitution. After the Articles of Confederation fell apart, come up with the idea for the Constitution, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay hand out leaflets. The first is Federalist 1. And in it, Hamilton rails against partisanship. Right? He says that the ambition, avarice, personal animosity, party opposition, and many other motives not more laudable than these are apt to operate as well as those who support as opposed to those who oppose the right side of a question. So just because you want the right outcome and you want the right policy outcome doesn't mean you're a good person. You're also going to lie, cheat, and steal to get your way. And just because the people with whom you disagree with you does not therefore make them evil or awful. But what ends up happening is we end up screaming at each other. Right? Nothing can be more ill-judged than the intolerant spirit which has at all times characterized political parties. For in politics, as in religion, it is equally absurd to aim at making proselytes by fire and sword. Heresies in either can rarely be cured by persecution. But we do this all the time. Right? Hamilton noted in the late 1700s that a problem with politics is we scream at each other. We assume that we are right and righteous and just because we agree in the same policy outcome. And therefore, everybody who agrees on our policy outcome is therefore righteous, righteous, and just. And if you disagree with me, you must be a bad person. Because you couldn't possibly come to a different conclusion, because I'm a good person, and I came to this conclusion. If you came to a different conclusion, you were therefore a bad person. And to prove that, I'm going to scream at you until you relent. That's terrible. It doesn't work. None of you have ever been persuaded by anybody who said, you know, if you weren't such an idiot, you would agree with me. So again, that's an excellent point. I should stop being such an idiot. Thank you. I had not considered it that way. Right? I worked for Senator Kennedy, for whom the institute across the street is named, and we had windows opening up on Constitution Avenue across from the Capitol, and every year the pro-life group would march to the Supreme Court on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And they would stop under our windows, because everybody knew where the senators' windows were, and they would shout and chant, and they'd hold up coffins and pictures of aborted fetuses and things like that. As if that hadn't occurred to us, as if them yelling at us, somebody would go on the balcony and, look, I had no idea. Senator, have you seen this? They have coffins. They have clever signs, Senator. I had no idea. Like, that just doesn't work, right? I worked on the Affordable Care Act in the House of Representatives, and there are people outside screaming, kill the bill, kill the bill, kill the bill. I was brought in to help pass the legislation. I was working for a congressman who was a doctor who ran on health care reform. There was never any question about what he was going to do. I thought, really, kill the bill? That's an option? We can do that? Right? And the idea that it's daft, but that's what we do. Right? So these are, the other thing I would highlight is before we get into how this ends up getting applied, is that even social media, everybody thinks that like the wheels somehow came off with social media. American politics was happy and just and joyous until Donald Trump and Twitter, and then everything's gone to hell since. In the Jefferson-Adams election of 1780, Jefferson hired somebody to make up stories about John Adams and place them in opposing newspapers, including the fake news that if he were elected, Adams would invade France. Right. Jefferson was accused of being a half-breed son of a squaw whose father was a mulatto. And the president of Yale, which is the UMass of Connecticut, who supported John Adams, said that if Jefferson were elected, our wives and daughters would be subject to legal prostitution. Abraham Lincoln was accused of being a drunk. I mean, this is kind of what we do in American politics, right? That doesn't, however, make it okay. And even then, even the social media piece is just what we used to do, only much more so. All of you have read George Orwell? At some point you lied about having read George Orwell, 1984, Animal Farm. He wrote an essay. He's wrote a couple of important essays in this regard. In a book called Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, which is about the ideological origins of the American Revolution, unsurprisingly, the author quotes Orwell writing about pamphlets and pamphleteers, right? And a pamphlet, that's how we did, I think social media is just really inefficient. So people handing stuff out on street corners, nailing it to posts and trees. They could be anything: prose, poetry, put to song, stories, maps, charts. All they had to do was be scurrilous, partisan, and short. Orwell's description of the pamphlets of the 1700s is basically Twitter. Right? This is kind of what we do and kind of how we've done it. All of these things are bad, arguably. Because they're bad, because they've always been, doesn't mean we can't make them better. There's a book going to be coming out next spring that looks at the theory and practice of political communication ethics, and half the chapters are from academics and half the chapters are from practitioners. One of the guys who wrote a chapter, is a guy named Ed Brookover. And Brookover ran the delegate selection process for Trump in the last election. He ran Ben Carson's presidential. He's close to President Trump. And his argument in his chapter is politics in America has always been a hot mess, but it should be better, and it can be better, and it must be better. And that's on all of you. So I want to talk about some of the ways we talk about things, especially when it comes to public policy. So we've got this set up. Politics is hard. It's always been a mess. People have always complained about spin doctors, lobbyists, and people like me. American politics has always been awful and ugly. How does that then manifest in 2019, 2020 for advocacy, for things like increasing or decreasing funding for education, for climate, for race, for poverty, for water, for whatever it is that interests you? I'll talk about a couple of things you may have touched on in other classes. The first is the idea of agenda setting. Any of you know agenda setting? It's the idea that the media don't tell us what to think, they tell us what to think about. So it tells what matters, therefore what doesn't matter. Framing. What something is and what it's about, therefore what it's not about. We talk about some of the tactics and trade-offs. Do you have to compromise your principles for your cause? Whose stories get told? What about pictures? And a dirty hands problem. So we'll talk about these in order. First is agenda setting. All of you are smart. Not everybody, you know a bunch of people who aren't at UMass Boston who couldn't hack it here or who decided to do something else. Right? It's hard to be in college. Your professors are smarter. I mean, hopefully, right? You're writing checks to somebody. Hopefully it's for value. And I'm the guest speaker. So how smart must I be? All of us can only keep a track of a handful of things at once. We think we're clever, good beasts, but with apologies to Winnie the Pooh, we're all just bears with little brains. We can keep track of a handful of things at once. Right? When you're thinking about politics, you're not thinking about your next exam, you're not thinking about your social life, you're not thinking about whatever else is going on. Right? If you're thinking about politics and you're thinking about Ukraine and the wall, you're not thinking about the elections in Brazil or the riots in the streets of Barcelona. If you're thinking about the riots in the streets of Barcelona and the elections in Brazil and the wall in Ukraine, you're not thinking about unemployment or water or race or FDA or transportation or something else. You just can't keep track of all of that stuff at once. The idea of multitasking is garbage. Every study ever has found that, no, I'm multitasking. I'm paying attention while I'm on Twitter. No, in fact, you're not. That can't happen. Which means that as an advocate, one of your first challenges as an advocate, if you're advocating for a public policy, first you've got to get somebody's attention. Some stuff shows up on the radar screen. The fires in California, all over the news. Right? That bumps something else off. I live in Washington, D.C. There was one story in Washington that has mattered for the past week, and it had nothing to do with Donald Trump. It was the Nats. They owned Washington. I'm a Red Sox fan. As far as I'm concerned, baseball season ended months ago. But Washington was consumed with the Nationals. That means something else wasn't on the agenda. If you want to get your issue on the agenda, if you want to get your public policy front of mind, who are you sacrificing? If you think, you know what, we really need to get people in Boston to care more about energy infrastructure, utilities, power outages, things like that, that means they've got to not think about maybe the T, maybe traffic. Is that a trade-off worth making? And it's easy in the abstract. If you're volunteering, do you pick the most important issue? The existential issue of our time, I would argue, is climate. Because that's the thing that could kill everybody. You are not going to solve it. All of us together in this room, if we spent every living moment for the rest of our lives, there just aren't enough of us, right? But it's the most important. Or do you pick a little thing that you can solve, but maybe won't have that big an impact? Maybe it's just sustainability here at UMass Boston. How do you choose that? And if you're working sustainability, are you then saying all the other things that are going on here in Boston matter less? Race, transportation, education, income gap, gentrification, all of the other 1,000,006 things that are kicking around Boston. You as an advocate make that choice. And if you're a paid advocate like I am, you've got to then make that choice. I had one of my clients was a big international organization that shall remain nameless, but you've probably heard of them. And they wanted some legislation to solve a problem around drilling and mining in foreign countries. One of the best ways to ruin a country is to find precious metals, minerals, gas, or oil underneath it. It's called the resource curse. It just breaks countries. And they had what they thought was a good legislative solution. If we do these things in Congress, we can diminish that. And so, sure, I can help do that because I know how Congress works. But I had to learn about the issue. Right? So I learned about the issue, and I have friends who kind of work in this space and did a bunch of research. And it turns out the solution probably wouldn't work. It wouldn't hurt, wouldn't be counterproductive, but it might not help. So I go to the client and I say, I've done some poking around. I got to tell you, I'm not sure this is the right approach. No, we got it, this will be good. So I went ahead and did it. Great, no harm, except that every dollar that organization was spending chasing a ghost they were never going to catch is a dollar they weren't spending on a problem they could solve. Was that okay? And I'm not sure. I'd like to say yes, because it was me. Of course I'm always right. It's all of the rest of you people. All of you do this with politicians. They don't fool me. It's my neighbor I'm worried about. Have you met my neighbor? He's really not so, but not me. Right? So I think it was okay, but on the other hand, they were paying me. Second question then is framing. Once it's on the agenda, what's it about? And issues are about a lot of things. Every issue is about, the term of art in political science is that issues are multidimensional. Right? I did a lot of criminal justice and death penalty work for a while. And when you talk about the death penalty in America from pre-revolutionary era up until about 1999, it was about whether or not murderers and rapists deserve to live. And depending on how old you are or what was going on, it was the Hitler question, the Bin Laden question, the Jeffrey Dahmer question. It was that question. Did they deserve to live? And if the answer is, does someone who murders and rapes little girls repeatedly deserve to live? The answer is probably no. Right? And that's how the conversation around the death penalty was framed. And everything else fell aside from that because it didn't make any sense. You say to somebody, well, why do you support the death penalty? Well, it deters crime. No, in fact, it doesn't deter crime. In fact, in I think it was the 1700s or 1800s, you could get executed for horse theft in Virginia, but not in Maryland. But in Virginia, there's more horse theft than in Maryland. The death penalty hasn't deterred anything ever. Oh, I didn't know that, but I support the death penalty. Why? My tax dollars, I don't want those people watching TV and pumping iron and doing whatever. Actually, the death penalty costs about 10 times more than life in prison without parole. Trials are complicated. They all live in solitary. Right? They get their own, it's a death house. It's called, they get their own house, right, as opposed to being in general population. Oh, I didn't know that. I support the death penalty. Why? You go on and on. You talk about race, you talk about deterrence, all that. Doesn't matter because the death penalty is about, it is framed as, does somebody who rapes and murders little girls deserve to live? And the answer is no. A group of people in 1999, 2000, 2001 said, we're not going to have that conversation. We're going to make the death penalty about something else. We're going to make it about DNA testing, innocent people on death row, and flawed trials. And the argument was, I don't care what you think about the death penalty. But if we're going to execute people, shouldn't we be sure they're guilty first? DNA is finding innocent people on death row. There's a lawyer in Alabama, I think it was Alabama, maybe Georgia, who referred to his own client with a racial epithet. In Texas, there was a lawyer who slept through the trial. And on appeal, the judge said it might have been a tactical decision. Like the snoring to drown out the jury, I don't know how that works. Oh, so now the death penalty gets reframed as innocence and fairness. The death penalty is on the decline. They abolished it in a bunch of states. The Supreme Court handed out some important rulings on it. President Bush signed critical legislation into law this Saturday before he was reelected. Because it's about something else. Seems like a good thing. I'm kind of proud of the work I did on that. Paid me well for a while. I think we helped some people. But the system's now locked into place and we've avoided the moral conversation. And we never had the race conversation. Because my job was to win. And the way you win is you find out what people find persuasive and you remind them of that. You're not comfortable talking about race, you're not comfortable talking about poverty, but you are really committed to everybody getting a fair trial because you were a defense attorney once? Cool, I'm going to talk to you about fair trials. You believe in fair trials? I believe in fair trials. I'm going to make this about fair trials. You care a lot about DNA testing. You've got a background as a chemist. I'm going to talk to you about DNA testing. And I'm going to go down and go down and go down. Right? And I don't need the people who already think the death penalty is morally wrong. I got them. And the people who think the death penalty is fundamentally racist, I got them. So I'm going to go pick off these other people. So I'm advancing a good, but I'm reinforcing a system that's fundamentally racist. I am not having the hard conversation about race. I'm not having the hard conversations about poverty. And I may be making it harder to have those conversations. Right? How you frame it, how you start a conversation determines how you end the conversation. How you start the conversation can help you win. It can help advance good policy. You're talking about the ethics of policy. But winning this debate might make it harder to win the more important or more fundamental debate. Right? My friends who support Bernie Sanders think that we need to just burn the system down. My friends who support almost every other Democrat. There, by the way, if you go to Ballotpedia, I love Ballotpedia. It's a terrific website. They list everybody who's officially registered to run for president. And to register with the Federal Elections Commission, you have to, I think, have raised $5,000. Almost 1,000 people have filed to run for president, including 286 Democrats. You think the debate stages are crowded now. Imagine like that'll be crazy town. But of all the main candidates, my friends who support Sanders saying we just have to, like, you can't fix capitalism. And to say, well, you know what, maybe he's right, but we've got to vote for Senator Harris because she's thoughtful and moderate, or we've got to vote for Vice President Biden or Mayor Buttigieg. My really liberal friend's argument is that's bad because all you're doing is reinforcing a system that is fundamentally flawed from the word go. But it's got to be better than the current guy. I'm a partisan. I mean, if some of you are Trump supporters, that's, whatever, but I worked for the last guy, so put up with the partisanship. I would say like anything other than, a day old Danish is better than what we've got in the White House, so I don't care who you vote for, as long as it's a Democrat. But if I do that, the next time, yeah, but now we got to make sure we have the majority in the House. Yeah, but we got to get the majority back in the Senate. Oh, we got to keep the White House. You're always one Democrat away from doing the right thing. At some point, don't you have to do the right thing? But if you're focused on doing the right thing, you're going to get your ass kicked. Okay, so how do I do the right thing? I've got to win this. And it's that set of trade-offs. It's those little bits. It's that Fitzgerald line. It's the little blows that you don't notice. And then suddenly, you can't see it, but apparently this looks crap on video, but that's intentional. I'm sort of playing the mise en scène thing. Well, no? You're with me at least? Nothing. I got nothing. You're more honest than my students, and I appreciate that. All right. Let's talk about some of the tactics and trade-offs in the remaining moments. Trolley car problem from The Good Place. What's the trolley car problem?
Isn't it like you have to pick, you either kill 5 people to save 1, or you kill 1 person to save 5 people?
Right. So what do you do if you're an advocate? I'm going to say this one thing, which is going to get my favorite candidate elected. Warren, Harris, Buttigieg, Biden, Sanders, Booker, everybody else. But it'll be at the expense of all these other things. Right? I am going to advocate for this one policy, even if it hurts all of these other policies. Right? How do I do that?
Peter?
Yeah.
I just wonder, since we have more or less like 10 minutes left,
Yeah.
And then some of the students have to go to other classes, maybe we should leave some time for
We will.
questions that come up.
Yeah, we will.
Okay.
Another question is stories. Stories are really compelling. You win a campaign by telling a good story. Let me tell you a story about a young man. Right? It's a hero, hope, loss, and redemption. But whose story do you tell, and who owns that story? If I tell your story, is it now my story? I'm using it to my advantage? Who owns the story? Literally, who owns the story? Who benefits from the story? You ever heard of the term poverty porn? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one way, you show pictures of things. And look, we're raising awareness. Who's being made to look good here? The prince? Who's this about? Is it
not the prince.
or the?
All
Ed
redheads
Sheeran.
look alike.
No. I think actually. Is it Sharon?
Is the prince of something else?
I thought the headline was. But it was who's benefiting from this, and what are the ethics of this? Are you helping, or are you exploiting? We'll click through in a minute. This is a link, and we'll confirm later. Then, of course, there's the dirty hands problem. Do you do a little bad to get a lot of good? You're working for a candidate. The example is that's often given is you're working for a candidate who's really good and really just and really pure, really close race. A developer comes to him and says, I will fund the rest of this campaign, but you got to help me out when you win. Your opponent is awful and evil from the word go and will suck up to the developer anyway. Do you cheat a little because you're better in the long run, or do you remain pure and lose and let the bad guys win entirely? It's the problem of dirty hands. And these are the little ethical decisions you'll make along the way as an advocate. Right? It's how do you talk about those little things in the moment that matter. So that is the end of the rant, and I'm happy to questions or input or whatever.
Questions?
Yeah.
How did you get into politics? How did you start?
I grew up in a political town. The other day I was digging in the basement for something and found a shirt my mom gave me when I was 7 or 8. It says Property Watergate Bugging Team. So it turns out I've come through politics honestly. And then I went to Emerson in the 80s and I volunteered in politics, interned at the Mass Democratic Committee. It just kind of hung around. I was in left politics, was in grad school in Arizona, and as a result of a series of running jokes about Jerry Brown, wound up running his campaign in the state in '92 and fell back into politics. I just kept showing up. It's a good, as my first chief of staff said, it's a good job for somebody with a good memory and a short attention span.
I like that.
Yeah, and as you heard from my bio, I've got a really short attention span.
I'll ask you a question. Who's in some way, right, if we start paying attention to framing and we start paying attention to agenda and to trade-offs and to the risks of getting our hands dirty as soon as we get involved in these kind of things, if the point and the purpose of the project on ethics and political communication is to make the situation better than it is, who's the audience? Politicians, students like are here right now? I mean, since you can't do all of them.
I would love to say it's people like me, but I'm not going to change. I'm in my mid-50s. I've been doing this for a long time. I'll get better on the margins. You're not going to change how I think about these things. It's you. I need to reach you to reach them. I teach a course on ethics and political communication at GW. My students go into politics. My alumni have been one of the top lawyers for President Obama, Senator Pompeo's speechwriter, the only speechwriter Marco Rubio ever had. One who's a junior is a confidential assistant to the Deputy Treasury Secretary. And so it's helping them, helping you, take a moment and think. And I have former students come back and talk to my ethics classes, and inevitably they say, I hadn't thought about this until it was a little bit too late. And there's one young woman who's now a press secretary at the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. At the time, she was working on a Senate campaign in Florida, and she laid out a series of problems where she didn't stop to think until it was too late. And she almost burned down her career and a bunch of friendships because she was moving too fast. So the idea is, as you think about policy and the philosophy of policy, utilitarianism or whatever it is, how are you talking about it? And just take that breath. Don't send the email at 3 in the morning. Don't sign off on something because you want to beat traffic. I think I've done more or less a good job. I believe deeply in our system and our politics. I have almost certainly done some really stupid and dangerous things. You need to do fewer stupid and dangerous things. That's my hope.
Yeah. Oh, so I was like wondering. So okay, so there's a lot of things going on, but like, it was striking that it seemed that you were mostly thinking about these things in closed rooms, right?
Yeah.
So like when you were saying that that it doesn't help to stand there and like hold a sign. I mean, you're not trying to convince the person in the room. You're trying to send a message. You're trying to agenda setting. You're trying to do, you're trying to shift the conversation. You're trying to put pressure. You're trying to use the leverage that you have. So like, so you're just misunderstanding the argument when you're thinking that it's to convince the senator to actually kill the bill.
No, I'm not.
But you're trying to make them worried, right?
No, I'm not. I'm not misunderstanding. I assure you, I'm
no,
not
but when the way
misunderstanding
you're saying it to us, then.
No. So I want to be. There's a couple of important distinctions. The first is I'm not talking about civility, and I'm not talking about respect. Be more civil. Stop yelling at each other. In part because it's just exhausting, and in part because if you're always in civil, then there's nowhere to go. And if you're always disrespectful, there's nowhere to go. Right.
But that assumes that you have the other's ear.
No,
right?
let me.
No?
I promise I'll get there. Hang on. Sometimes when you are in civil, you do it in an ethical way. When you hold a sign, when you yell, do it in an ethical way. And my favorite example of this is Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Right, where there was the sign holding and the marching and the protesting, and it was necessary in Birmingham. And if you read his letter, if you haven't read his letter, read his letter. And his argument is, we had a deal with the white leaders of Birmingham, and they reneged on that deal.
Yeah.
They went back on their word.
Yeah.
So we have to now be in their face to make them uphold their word, but his arguments are rooted in the Old Testament and founding American documents. So you can be partisan and in your face and hold the sign and yell with an ethical foundation.
No, but let's
That's
just
my
add
request.
that letter was addressed to the white moderate.
Yes.
That letter was
Yes.
addressed to somebody
Yes.
in which he could create a conflict.
Yes.
Because, like you're saying,
Yes.
you find a
Yes.
common ground, and they had already said they
Yes.
supported this thing, so he could speak in that way.
Yes, and he did, but it was from an
But-
ethical foundation.
I'm just saying,
Yeah.
right? You first need to be in a conversation with somebody where they have an vested something that they must listen.
Yes, you do that, but
and your
I'm suggesting-
examples sort of suggest that when you also said you find the common ground
Yeah.
with people in these,
Yeah.
but I'm just thinking that in a lot of these quite frustrated situations now, that's precisely what we don't have.
But then I think that's true, and it can be a challenge to find it, and you're not always going to find it. There's going to be a chunk of people who are going to vote for the Democrat no matter what. There's going to be a bunch of people who are going to vote for the Republican no matter what. But you never persuaded anybody by screaming at them. Part of the holding the sign and the screaming is you're telling your supporters. Part of it is there's like, stop preaching to the choir. Well, there's a reason you go to church, because you need to be elevated, right? And part of marches are for that. Part of marches are to get on the agenda. Pay attention to me. It's really, really hard to get on the agenda with a march because we've had a lot of marches and it's just, oh my gosh, and you got to play the news cycle, right, and all of that. But please do that. What I'm suggesting is do that in a way that is rooted in a set of democratic ideals. So King's letter and also the I Have a Dream speech were said the problem was America had broken its own promise to itself. It wasn't burn it down because all of you people suck. It was we need to meet the American dream. Right? So it's almost the premise from which you are arguing. And we can talk about the tactics of protest and do they work. The research indicates that sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. There was so much wrong with the kill the bill people. But you can do it in a way that advances a conversation. And it gets trickier in American politics because politicians, like everybody else, behave through incentives. You're here because you have an incentive to be here. Some of you are here because you're interested, and it could be hopefully an interesting conversation. Some of you are here, frankly, because you need the grade, and that's fine, right? You behave your incentives. I behave my incentives. Politicians do too. They want to keep their jobs. Because we're so gerrymandered, because of our current politics, it's easier to lose your job by compromising than it is by shouting. So you've got a bunch of Republicans who are unwilling to break with the president because they get beaten up in the press for it. You've got a bunch of Democrats who are unwilling to break with Speaker Pelosi because I'm a little bit afraid of her. I have a feeling she'd take you back and just, she'd club you. She's really good at her job, right? So there's less of an incentive. So then the question is, how do you create an incentive to get people to do what you want them to do? And how do you have that conversation? And if you're going to protest and hold the sign, which is important, my only request is do it in a way that leaves room to advance the next conversation. So that's it.
So I know some of you need to go. You're welcome to go if you need to go to the next class. Others are welcome to stay to continue the conversation.